Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for joining Somerford Associates podcast. We are going to be talking about why do you want to create your cloud strategy with your security strategy. So integrating the two of those together. And so for that, I've got Baz Donoghue. Welcome, Baz.
Thank you.
So we'll go into why we want to do it, how one should do it, there's not always a should, but how we suggest you could do this with our 3 Vs, vision, value, visibility. We'll go through that later. And then most importantly, practical examples of how to do this and how it works. So anything else we want to throw into the conversation, Baz?
There might be some stuff that crops up as we talk, I think, that might come to mind. But let's see how we get on and we can chuck stuff in.
Cool. Do you want to just give a quick update of who you are and why you're talking about cloud strategy for the listeners in case they haven't met you before?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Baz Donoghue. I'm a solutions consultant at Somerford Associates, and I've also been building out our cloud security strategy as well, which essentially encompasses understanding not just our kind of specific tools that are within our kind of our offering catalog, but the general types of tooling around cloud security and conventional kind of static infrastructures tooling as well, and how best to integrate those, both with a view to kind of trying to realize as much value as possible from kind of cumulatively building up these capabilities, but as well as seeing where customers already have, maybe 1, 2 or more of these capabilities, and they maybe aren't integrated in such a way where they're not getting as much value or as much visibility as they could do. So it's kind of taking a wide view lens look at those types of capability.
And why do you want to do it then? Why does someone need to do this? So
it's an interesting question. So with regard to cloud security, I don't think it's any secret that it's, certainly if your organization is starting to make those steps towards being to leveraging cloud capability, whether or not that's from an infrastructure perspective through IaaS, whether or not you're leveraging software as a service, and all the various different acronyms and capabilities that are in between, you need to have some sort of security strategy for doing so. Many customers, as we've kind of spoken to, or many organizations, as we've spoken about maybe on previous podcasts, have kind of taken what we call that running jump into cloud. Others have had a more measured approach into cloud, and others have kind of started off in cloud and then they're cloud only. And depending on where you are in that level of maturity, you're still going to need to have a view of what your security requirements are, and depending on where you are in that journey will depend exactly on what you kind of need to have a look at. So it was built out around some customers, initially the ones taking these running jumps into cloud to maintain operations, then retrospectively having a look back and saying, oh, okay, well, we've built all this stuff in our cloud, we've built all this capability, and we've operationalized it really well, but now we need to take a backwards look and almost retrospective look at our security, because we've seen in news, we've seen in articles, we've seen across industry that cloud-based threat vectors have increased massively through various different reasons that we've kind of talked about before, but we will no doubt talk about again.
So the threats increased. Yeah. Everyone's got some sort of big, nebulous, messy situation with cloud, whether they're hybrid, partly on-prem. Okay. So we definitely need to think about security along it. How are people doing it then when we're talking to these clients? How are most people securing their cloud?
Yeah, good question. So I think there's various different camps of thought, and there's various different camps of capability as well, I suppose, when it comes to being able to deploy security controls for cloud. There's quite a lot, but I'll probably maintain around 3 at the minute. So one is customers who are maybe hybrid in their approach to cloud. So they've started statically, and they're moving towards leveraging more and more cloud capability. So typically that really starts with our IaaS solutions and maybe some elements of SaaS, so Office 365, for example, and then branching out into elements of Azure, AWS, and kind of GCP from a Google perspective, and kind of leveraging those platforms. And what they tend to do is try to maintain security controls around those cloud technologies based on how they do it on their static infrastructure. So whether or not that's through routing of traffic back through their VPN and maybe to an on-premise security stack. So that's one methodology that we've seen, or trying to translate those kind of security controls that they have on their static infrastructure across to native security controls within their cloud infrastructure. So from an Azure and then from an Office 365 perspective, if they're familiar with Windows and they're familiar with the kind of policies and services that they can apply their security controls around on-prem, then they can somewhat translate those across into some elements of the cloud.
Okay.
So there'll be some customers who have that approach. There are other customers who have an approach of using quite heavily leaning into the tools provided by those cloud solutions. So particularly if they're very heavily into leveraging cloud resource or elastic resource, so AWS, GCP, and Azure. So they tend to leverage the tooling that's available within those particular cloud platforms. So when we talk about AWS, it's things like GuardDuty, CloudTrail, and the Security Hub, etc. And again, various different security services for within GCP, and then Microsoft again has a whole raft of other offerings. So they tend to leverage those and use those in conjunction with either their static infrastructure security tools, so feeding back if they've got some on-prem log analysis platform potentially, and maybe doing some updating of their kind of security use cases, and kind of trying to maintain the level of security control that way. And then we have other customers who typically are kind of cloud only, like cloud. They take a cloud first approach, and they tend to leverage like security tools that are available in the cloud that are outside of those security platforms. So traditionally, what were CASB solutions, but now I don't really like to call them CASB. I mean, CASB is a capability, but a lot of the solutions that say that they're a CASB solution, they actually do a lot more. So they're kind of a lot more, that they're a cloud security platform and capability in their own right. And CASB is a part of a service, a microservice potentially that they offer around that.
And the advantages of doing this third way. So we got hybrid, but treat it like it's on-prem. The second one is use the tools native cloud security facility. And then there's the cloud first one where you use a whole separate vendor for your security.
Yes,
which I suppose has the advantage of not being tied to just AWS or tied to just GCP, because you can have it on top of all of it.
You can, and it kind of offers. I mean, I don't think it'd be any secret to say, kind of offers you the best position from a security standpoint, but that's because you're leveraging various different tools from a security perspective. But obviously, the offshoot of that is you need these additional products. And you need to work into configuring and understanding how you're going to leverage these additional products. So whilst it's fantastic, one of the more ideal solutions, it isn't without its drawbacks from either a deployment or a procurement perspective as well.
Yeah. Do you have an impression of where you think people should get to, where the vision of most of the CISOs is, where they want to be?
That's a great question, actually. I think what I would like to see is CISOs within organizations kind of already know where they need to be, if I'm honest. I think when it comes to that kind of vision, that cloud security vision, I think they already have that vision, right? For the most part, pretty much nearly every organization CISO that we've spoken to has that vision. They appreciate the risk within cloud. They appreciate the need to secure it. And they appreciate the kind of discrete, particular nuances and use cases dependent on how their organization does business with the cloud. So I think they already appreciate that. I think the challenge is being able to take that really kind of top level overarching vision and being able to translate it tactically down to the next level. So we're not kind of nuts and bolts building up the kind of actual technical capability, being able to make that link between the strategic view and the tactical view, and ensuring that the requirements, the requirements within the vision are met at that level by being able to articulate the specific kind of security use cases that are required, and ultimately what the goal is. What is clarifying that vision. We're going to talk about the 3 V's, but it's understanding exactly what do we mean, as opposed to kind of having these broad sweeping statements of, we want to invest in cloud security.
Yeah. What does that mean in your
organization? What does that mean for you? Yeah. What does that? What's more important to you? Where should you focus first, and where can you kind of leverage what you're already doing, and how and where do you kind of need to build up maybe a new kind of policy or a new strategy to address something that's emerging in trends that we see in cloud security.
Do you have an example of where you've helped someone take that high level vision and actually translate it to what we actually need to do tactically in their security environment?
Yeah. So we have a customer of ours, a long-standing customer of ours, who we work closely with, both from a professional services perspective, but also helping provide kind of additional context from a security perspective. So again, their security team already had a vision. They already understood what it was that they wanted to achieve. And what we were doing was kind of helping them gently from a people and process perspective, but essentially trying to get them to leverage their tooling to provide them with as maximum value that we could. And we managed to help them to build up to that point. And then based upon that, we were having conversations around about what the strategy is moving forward from a cloud perspective. And now that the kind of more on-premise securities, the more on-premise security controls have been put in place and the security practices were there, what the next stage was. And we kind of had a look at that cloud capability. And actually from this customer's perspective, they already had these capabilities. So they already had the tooling in place. It was just somewhat siloed, and it had been utilized to address a couple of use cases, but not that it could do so much more. So we had conversations around about, how are you currently utilizing this tool? Is it, from what you're utilizing it for, is it the best tool for you? Or is it better off to have something that maybe doesn't have quite the same capability, but does those specific elements that you want? And actually the desire was there to utilize the whole kit that was provided by this capability. It was just a matter of how we integrate that with the way that the organization was currently carrying out their security practices. So we had a look at the capability, we had a look at how they were utilizing it, and then we had a look at marrying up that with the current practices that the SOC were carrying out from a strategy perspective, and came across some nice paradigms that we could pull across both ways, really. So helping expand the SOC's view of cloud security threats and pulling them in a way that the SOC would like to do their business, and then also being able to take the SOC's expertise and pass it back through to the team in charge of managing that platform to help them develop their policies and processes on that platform to better secure it. So that was quite a good win from that perspective. But the challenge, I suppose, there is kind of something we're going into is again, it can be really difficult for some organizations to articulate what their security vision, what their security strategy is from a cloud perspective is. And one of the elements that I know that we've been working on is kind of trying to demystify this process. There's lots and lots of security tooling. There's lots and lots of acronyms. I think there's a new buzzword, at least one new buzzword, if not, a few per day from a cloud security perspective. And being able to understand what all these capabilities mean. Are they relevant to us as an organization? Is this something that we should be focusing on? Is this something that we already do? A lot of these questions are things that are being asked at that level, and it's difficult to articulate it based on the information that's given, but on these products alone. So that's kind of where we've really tried to build out the kind of so what element by saying, okay, well, let's give you some practical examples of use cases that leverage that are common cloud security threats and the technologies that are used to provide security controls around them, and see if that's a fit for your organization. Is that something that you're concerned about? And if it is, then we can nicely articulate, okay, well, this is the kind of product you want. It needs to integrate with these products, and this is the overall capability solution that you're going to get. And trying to demystify it that way.
Yeah, that's really valuable, because I'm not full time in technical work like this as you are. So keeping abreast of all those buzzwords and things and trying to cut through the new ones and how they apply in our clients' worlds is a real challenge. So I'm glad I'm chatting with you on time. Let's throw in a practical example here. We've gone through vision, and we've sort of hinted on like how to get the best value from the tools that you've got already. But let's throw in a practical example.
Sure. One that I've seen more recently, it's becoming more and more relevant, is around EDR. Okay. So, and what's interesting about EDR, and what's actually quite interesting about cloud security solutions or traditional CASB solutions, is a concern from my perspective, from clients and customers, about how to deploy and manage those technologies, and almost a reluctance to do so. So the reason being is, if you look at a tool like an NDR, or you look at certain security capabilities like log analysis or network analysis, that can from an operations perspective is typically deemed to be much more passive, much more passive from deploying those capabilities to the end user, because you're deploying them at that kind of the network layer. Maybe you've got various different sensors that you're deploying, and typically the end user working away on their UAD or their endpoint, they typically they won't be affected by that kind of configuration. Whereas as soon as you start to talk about deploying agents to endpoints or capabilities to endpoints, then security personnel immediately start to get a bit fidgety, because it maybe took them a significant amount of time to get to a point where they've got this gold state disk image that they've deployed to their endpoints. They may be already managing several other kind of endpoint solutions, such as antivirus or various different update capabilities. So adding additional agents onto inboxes is often a concern.
Yeah.
But what we have seen is kind of raising the requirement for it based on kind of threats that are discovered at the cloud. So, for example, if we were going to utilize Netskope, and we're going to leverage Netskope, which is a cloud security capability with various different security capabilities within that. So from a CASB solution through to cloud threat detection and DLP elements as well. One nice integration that we've seen from a Netskope perspective is if we were to deploy Netskope, ideally we would deploy with an agent on the endpoint, and that agent would then steer our users' traffic through to our to our tenant, and then all of our traffic can be inspected. There are also elements where our Netskope tenant is also going to inspect our cloud storage capabilities, whether or not that's IaaS, so if that's public cloud, or if it's SaaS. So, for example, we want to be able to scan our OneDrives, we want to be able to scan our Google Drives, we want to be able to scan our boxes, etc., for malicious content that's been uploaded there, and they could potentially be then downloaded by our user base. But we also want to be able to check for those natively in the resources of the IaaS solutions as well, so S3 buckets or blob storage, because again, they're places where malicious content could be stored. Now, Netskope will protect us from those if we configure it correctly. So it can retrospectively scan those areas, and it can actively make sure that malware doesn't get delivered to those areas as well. But what it can't really do is help us in providing, if for whatever reason some malware did get downloaded onto an endpoint, it's quite difficult for us to be able to tell what happens thereafter. So we with Netskope, we can easily tell it went to a particular endpoint, it was downloaded by a particular user, and have all the information surrounding that. But once it's on an endpoint, it's really difficult for us to understand what it did. So therefore, depending on how the organization is configured, lateral movement becomes really easy for the attacker, because we can't see it, right? However, if the customer does have an EDR solution, then you can sync the two up. So what you can say is any kind of threats that Netskope came across, any kind of artifacts, some malicious artifacts that were detected, we can take the hashes of those files and we can pass that through as threat intelligence dynamically through to the EDR solution. So then Netskope's essentially saying, hey, found a load of stuff that's been delivered to our absolutely massive cloud environment, which is a huge footprint that can be pretty much attacked from more or less anywhere. And we've got all this really juicy information with regards to malicious files. Here's a heads up, here's some files, keep an eye for these on the endpoints. And then the endpoints can be completely up to date with not just generic file hashes that we're seeing, but actual file hashes that you've seen in your cloud environment.
So and we know to look out for, focus it in.
Okay. Yeah, so EDRs will look for all kinds. and they'll try and give you as broad a coverage as possible. But if there's a new threat that's being specifically delivered to your cloud services, and we detect those on the cloud, we want to be able to pass that information to the endpoint to protect them as well. So then you're protected both at the interface from the customer and the interface in the cloud. So that's from the user and in the cloud. So you're covered on both ends of the spectrum there.
That's a really good interoperable kind of example there, where you pass the information between the different tools.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's and you can expand that out further, right? So that's from my perspective, relatively straightforward, right? With passing through some threat intelligence. Well, you could do the reverse as well. So you can, if an EDR solution detects a threat on an endpoint, again, you could be able to pass that information back into Netskope, and then Netskope will be able to, based on the outcome, you can apply then some security controls based around that. So if there's something that you didn't detect, then again, they can mutually benefit from being able to update information
Cool.
based on those detections. Yeah.
Thank you. That's a good practical example. Let's delve more into that, getting the best value out of your Mashup tool.
Yes.
With the interoperability, because so full visibility to people listening, we have a suite of solutions, and they do various type of functions. And we're not saying you need all of them, and we're not saying you need necessarily even one of them. We're just saying that you need ones that do these generic titles, and they need to talk and interoperate together. So what are the generic capabilities that we're looking for out of these solutions?
Okay, so some common capabilities that we see interoperate. Okay, so first one would probably be identity access management.
Yep.
As we mentioned, so I think many people have heard of Okta. So again, Okta are one of our partner organizations and products. And again, so from an IAM perspective, I think that's kind of must, certainly if you're delving into cloud security, because if you don't have an IAM solution, then it becomes much more difficult for you to implement and start to leverage much more mature security capabilities later on. So, for example, if we look at any CASB, regardless of whether or not it's Netskope or another, one of the core tenets of being able to understand who is accessing what is being able to leverage IAM. Because without IAM, we can't apply security controls based on identity. So if you don't have IAM, then you can't do that, right? You can't understand which identities are accessing any cloud capability, whether or not or cloud services, whether or not they're your sanctioned cloud applications or not, and then you can't then retrospectively or inline apply security controls based on that. So I think the move, and I think most organizations are here, but the move away from usernames and static tokens to or having a list of accounts and moving more towards an identity and having a common identity is already being taken up by most organizations in one form or another. And I think it will underpin a lot of the security capabilities moving forward. One kind of evolution of IAM that we've seen as well, which is really interesting at the moment, is kind of cloud PAM, right? So the elastic PAM, some people have been calling it. So privileged access management. So again, there's lots of capabilities. In fact, we have multiple capabilities that can provide that are a PAM solution. But there can be certain challenges when it comes to being able to provide a PAM solution that is truly elastic. So what we mean here is that if within an IaaS solution or within our public cloud, we've configured one of our or several of our resources to be elastic, so that if we need, for example, we have a web service, and if our web service becomes inundated and we can no longer handle the traffic that are currently assigned, the resources are assigned to that particular service, then we can automatically expand out the resources available to us. So we spin up more resources on the end. We have more web servers. We have to help the web servers. We have more load balancers. We spin up more load balancers, and in order to help those, we have more database backends, and everything kind of grows elastically to help us deal with that surge of requirement, and then it shrinks itself back down. And this can happen in seconds, or even it can happen across minutes or hours. It can happen across seconds, and being able to help with that kind of explosive burst of additional security footprint that we need to manage. Sometimes there's PAM solutions that find that difficult to keep up with. So elastic PAM at the minute is something that's really interesting. And I know something that's certainly been worked from an Okta perspective with their advanced server access, which enables you to be able, they're predominantly focused on the dev environment, so that developers can access in a secure way any of these resources that are being spun up in public cloud, either as completely new projects or as devices that have been expanded out elastically, but using the same identity in a manner that is useful to them. So they're not having to necessarily log on through some sort of third-party or proprietary desktop management solution. They can SSH straight into a box, or they can RDP straight onto a box, which is what developers want to do. They don't want to have to faff about with. If they
do the SOC use that as well? Like if there was an incident, it just happens to be on the expanded box.
It's a good question. Potentially, it depends on the roles, responsibilities, and capabilities of the SOC. So some organisations keep those standard. So there's an argument for conflict of interest.
Yeah.
So we don't really want SOC analysts logging into our boxes. We want them to be able to provide us with information and give it and help triage a security incident, but we don't necessarily want them to go and do the triage themselves. But other organizations, actually, they're adapting to having these kind of super SOCs almost, where all of the members of the SOC they're analysts in their own right, but they also work across all the various different other capabilities as well. And in that case, maybe they will do. So they might not do it necessarily if they're in that SOC hot seat, but they may well access that in order to start to triage a security incident. It kind of depends on how the organization have configured their runbooks.
Yeah. So we hinted at SSH. So I suppose there's a lot of secrets as well across the whole infrastructure, and you need to.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So from a secret management perspective, there's a couple of different challenges. So one absolutely is around accessing resources in our public cloud. Mm-hmm. Which is hopefully going to be managed by some sort of identity solution, but isn't necessarily always. But then if we take that and couple that with multi-cloud environments, so they don't necessarily all play very nicely together, so you might have to have individual identities for each multi-cloud environment, depending on how you're configured. And then when we look at SaaS even further, again, you may need multiple, not just for users accessing SaaS solutions, but for all of your integrations through API or otherwise, or internal communications between services. Typically, you're going to need some sort of secret, whether or not it's a certificate, it's a token, be that REST or any other. And managing these tokens can then become incredibly difficult. So this is where we've seen secret management become more and more prevalent, certainly in the cloud space. Not purely because they're a secure vault for us to be able to secure our secrets. So actually, our users and our developers don't need to interact with those secrets. Our solution will do that for them by proxy. So not just from that perspective, but from the perspective that there's other capabilities built in. So things that are, we kind of haven't put it on there, but I think we talked about it last time, which is like encryption as a service.
Ooh, okay, yeah.
As well. So, developers working in the cloud, developing what they need to develop, and they don't necessarily want to have to develop the specific mechanisms for encrypting the data that's either at rest in the endpoints or is communicated between the various different endpoints or moving parts within their capability. So they maybe want encryption as a service, and typically these secret management solutions they harbor that as well. Mm-hmm.
And for that, we think HashiCorp Vault.
HashiCorp Vault, yes, yeah, absolutely. Specifically, HashiCorp Vault for that comes to mind, and not just that, but it interacts with all the other various different kind of supporting capabilities associated with a dynamic cloud environment. So take Terraform, so that's your infrastructure as code. Again, integrates very nicely with Vault, so that when we're configuring our infrastructure as code, anything that needs to be done securely, any secrets that we need to leverage as part of that deployment can all be leveraged nice and securely via Vault. So again, it's never presented within the code. It's never presented outside that interaction between those two different capabilities. Same again if we're going to expand it even further. So if you're looking at service-to-service communication, then again, HashiCorp Console will manage that as a secure service mesh. And again, leveraging Vault as part of that to help add in that kind of additional security by being able to encrypt the communication between those services. So all of these kind of different capabilities that we're seeing, service meshes, infrastructure as code, or secret management, regardless of whether or not it's HashiCorp or another, that we need the capability for them to all interact with us nicely, because human interaction is ultimately going to fall off from a cloud perspective. It's interesting discussions around whether or not it needs to, or whether or not it will, but I think there's arguments for both. So
that would be a whole nother podcast.
Yeah.
So okay, we got IAM, Cloud PAM, CASB, secrets management, encryption as a service, and then service meshes, infrastructure as code. Cool. Okay. It's time for another practical example.
Sure.
Let's throw in another practical example.
Okay, so we kind of talked around it with Elastic PAM, right? So let's have a discussion around how we would do that. So, for example, this is kind of born from an idea. Certainly, when we look at when we were looking at Okta's advanced server access, sometimes it can be difficult to articulate the requirement of an Elastic PAM solution like that. If you're just looking at the technical documentation and maybe some of the marketing elements, it could be kind of difficult to understand why that's any different from PAM and why you would actually need it, and what it gives you above and beyond other PAM solutions, or why it's relevant. So in order to do that, we kind of need to have conversations about exactly what is it that we're meaning to secure when we talk about development environments. And I won't go into it in too much detail now. I think we've done a webinar on it, and I think we'll be talking about it much more in the future. But essentially, it's being able to understand, which is kind of part of the vision. That kind of vision V is understanding, well, what is it we're actually protecting? So if we're talking about DevOps, Sec DevOps, DevSecOps, and all the variations in between, the different iterations, from my perspective, they have different connotations associated with them. So, if you're looking at DevSecOps or Sec DevOps, really, in my perspective, that's you developing a product, and that product aims to be secure. So if you're developing a software, you're developing something that is going to be delivered to a customer, either potentially also as a service, then it's ensuring that service is created and delivered in a secure way. And the DevSecOps and Sec DevOps argument is, well, do we do it after we've developed it, or do we do it as part of our development? And that's a whole new argument, and there are pros and cons for both sides. But actually, what we're seeing with a lot of our customers who don't do that, a lot of our customers are just helping maintain operational IT for their organization, solely for use within their organization, and some providing services on an edge to customers who, they don't develop code, they don't develop programs, but they do provide services externally to customers. Well, actually, they have development environments as well, and we want to secure that. So it's more about securing the development environment, because certainly in cloud, development environments, even not in cloud, development environments are a goldmine from threat actors, because typically most people who work within them have privileged access. They typically, through old ways of working, having done them myself in the past for my sins, you kind of have to leverage kind of all sorts. You typically leverage things like kind of little backdoors to help you get in. So whether or not, certainly when we're working statically, you might try and surreptitiously hide access on a box somewhere in case you don't get access to it anymore. You might be storing credentials locally, encrypted or otherwise. You may inadvertently be storing credentials in code. And again, if you're in that old castle and moat scenario, it didn't seem much of a problem because you're secure behind your moat, right? But in cloud, we know there is no boundary anymore. So we shouldn't be doing that and leveraging that. So typically in development environments, like I said, there's a huge swathe of information that can be used against your organization. And because they're developing, they might not necessarily have all of the security policies and process applied at that stage. So this is where kind of advanced server access comes in. If we were thinking about building a whole environment from scratch, and Splunk Cloud actually leveraged this, Splunk Cloud as a service. So when Splunk Cloud have a new customer and they need to spin up an entirely new, a highly new tenant for that customer from a cloud perspective, then what they do is they'll leverage Terraform, so infrastructure as code, to build out that environment for them, typically on AWS, but I think there are other platforms available. But they'll typically build them out on AWS. But what they'll do is they'll leverage Okta ASA at the same time, start to build out a list of users that can access these newly spun up instances and assign various different tokens. And then there's an ASA project that will then be assigned and linked across to those users. So that as soon as the Terraform instance is done spinning up what it needs to spin up, you can log onto it straight away with your identity. So you're not having to use admin and then the default. You're not having to use anything else. You can log straight into that box as a developer or as a supporting element to the organization straight
away. That makes sense. Okay. So should we go back into the other kind of capabilities that we need to have? So we've mentioned CASB.
We have, yeah.
Secure Access Service Edge.
There's a bit of SASE in there. So essentially what, if you were to say, so CASB technology has been around for a while, and as I said, a lot of capabilities that have this CASB capability, I think it's a bit unfair to just call them a CASB. They can do CASB, but they do so much more. And
Cloud Access Security Broker.
Cloud Access Security Broker, right? So it's brokering access between your cloud applications.
Yes.
We can do a whole lot more across all the platforms, certainly from a Netskope perspective. So Netskope doesn't do that. So not only is Netskope kind of a CASB solution, as we've mentioned, but it has all these other capabilities. So we've got some various forms of threat identification and threat detection, as well as data loss prevention, which allows us to provide these very granular controls around access to data and ensuring that it is only accessed by those who should access it if they meet certain criteria. So they have to be on the right endpoint, they have to be part of the right group, they have to be coming from the right place and carrying out the right activities for them to be able to maybe access elements. And again, that can be ephemeral and change dependent on where they're logging in from, which device they're logging in from, even time of day. So you can be extremely granular with that. So it carries out all of these capabilities as well. So there's swathed more capability that they carry out. And SASE is kind of the next evolutionary step, of which most of these capabilities already have a foot in that, have a foot across that line, where we're carrying out various elements of network security as well. So we're not just looking at the cloud, the SaaS area or kind of next gen web kind of secure web gateway elements. We're also looking at that network level and securing that network level of the cloud as well, and the kind of supporting network services and connectivity between them as well. So that's kind of where that whole secure edge comes from.
Yeah. So I think we've talked about capabilities which are based on users and also based on the infrastructure or the applications services talking to one another, and then getting into them, so brokering access to them or securing the edge of them, and then there's a whole suite of capabilities around, I presume, visibility across all of them.
Yeah, absolutely. So Splunk, data from anywhere platform. It's still being called like log analysis platform, but really data from anywhere platform. So if it's human readable, you can pull it in, and you can, whatever you want to do with that data, you can pretty much do it as long as you understand what it is you want to do. That's the biggest challenge.
Yes.
So yes, as we're seeing more and more information, there's almost a kind of somewhat of a shift we're seeing with regard to kind of log analysis platforms or data from anywhere platforms to be able to leverage that visibility. So whereas we were seeing, and it's still extremely relevant in static in static infrastructure, as well as some elements of dynamic. It's pulling as much information as is relevant against our use cases into a platform like Splunk, and then building out our alerting and detecting use cases based on that. If we're looking at from a security perspective, if we're looking at IT ops, maybe we're looking at measuring specific metrics or key indicators, trying to understand how we're doing hour on hour or day on day based on those. But when it comes to cloud security, sometimes it can be a little bit overwhelming to take the wealth of information that's provided by certainly IaaS solutions and many SaaS solutions, ingest them into a platform like Splunk, and then be able to apply logic across the top for a couple of different reasons. One is that there's literally hundreds of thousands of SaaS applications, and they might all report completely differently. They may have a completely different set of fields. They might they might have a completely different set of endpoints available. So the level of data, the verbosity of that data, and cardinality of the data is going to be completely different.
Yeah.
And sometimes interpreting that as a customer can be difficult, which is where we come in from a professional services perspective. But it can still be it's still a lot of information to process. And then if we look at the IaaS platforms like AWS, for example, again, if you turn everything on from CloudTrail, you turn every single VPC flow log on, and you ingest that into Splunk, then you're going to have a huge amount of information that you can search through. But sometimes it can be really difficult to pull out the value and the information in that. So what it would be better to do, and for some people as well, with regard to the information, they can only pull so much information in. So what we want to do is make sure that they can pull as much information as they can in, but the information that's most valuable and relevant to them. So the trend that we're seeing is the various different cloud security solutions, your Netscopes and your Okta from an IAM perspective, and all the various different HashiCorp elements that are based in the cloud are doing what they do, and then sending the information about what they've done into Splunk. So then Splunk becomes your single pane of glass for kind of the security element and the operational element. So rather than trying to reinvent the wheel, we let the tools do what they're best at doing.
Yeah.
Put all of that into one place, and then we can apply our own logic to get value out of it over the top of it.
Yeah. And then connect the dots as well between them.
Yeah, absolutely. So it can act as that interface. Certainly when we're talking about the kind of next step, like orchestration. So if we're talking about orchestration and automation, then again, the individual product cannot operate in an isolated manner if they need to, but we can pull it all into like a nerve center, and then have that nerve center do what it needs to do based on the information from all the other elements as well.
That makes sense. So, and then we get to the sort of, we didn't really speak about Varonis as a good visibility tool, but there we are. I've name dropped it there. But I think it comes up in your next practical example, probably. But then we've got processes on top. So HashiCorp does a lot of the kind of processes for improving the cloud operations. And then even processes in terms of how to buy all of these things on AWS Marketplace. There's so many different parts to this cloud security equation. And all
there is, the processes part around purchasing is actually interesting, right? Because some people would not really see it as much of a topic, but again, when we've had a look at our strategy, actually it is, and it falls in line with end user satisfaction as well. So we've talked about keeping the end user happy and making their experience as easy and as user friendly as possible, whilst trying to keep them as secure as possible. Because if you start to put blockers, you start to put bumps in the road in front of users, they'll just sidestep it. They'll go find a way to get around what your security controls in order for them to need to do what they need to do so they can do their job. The same is for purchasing, right? So if there's a fantastic solution that ticks all of your boxes, but it's nigh on impossible for you to get it. If you can't procure that and you procure it, you need a solution. So you're going to go somewhere else to do it. Right? And the problem is if that's another vendor or another capability from a different vendor, then fair enough. You might not be getting exactly what it is that you want, and they might not interleave quite so well with your capability. But there is the other risk of just going, okay, well, we don't know where to process this. It isn't clear how we purchase it. We're just going to go down that kind of open source route and start to build stuff ourselves. Or if we can't have access to an AMI, or if there's not an AMI that's been built that helps you really leverage a capability by spinning it up almost immediately, then customers will potentially go and start to spin up those EC2 instances themselves, start to develop all the code, and then that's when configuration starts to slip. And misconfiguration is probably the biggest cause of cloud-based threats being delivered from IaaS solutions or affecting IaaS solutions easily.
Yeah. Whereas in the sort of ideal situation, if you have the vendors on AWS Marketplace and you purchase it through there, it's all sort of more of a click of a button situation before you, and so there's less resistance to getting.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's tested, it's supported, it's all been pre-built and checked. So it's so much easier to leverage an image like that than it is to kind of try to build something custom. If you have to build something custom, that's cool. You can do that too. But if there's something that's available for you right there, then it's going to make.
Don't reinvent the wheel. Yeah. Okay. Last practical example then. Have you got one on visibility?
Have I got a use case on visibility? Yes. So, so we can leverage that kind of visibility element that we talked about configuration. So I just mentioned then. So one of the use case scenarios that we see very, very often is one that you've probably seen a lot in the media is ransomware. Okay, ransomware. So a bit of a hot topic, but essentially ransomware occurs regardless of where the data is. But if somebody can access your data and they can run a process against that data, then basically they're going to encrypt it so that you can't use it anymore. That's what it is, right? So they'll encrypt it in a way where you can't then unencrypt it. And there's a couple of different security controls, mitigations you can put in place. So one is you can back up all of your data all the time or at a decent increment so that if, for example, some data is exposed and does get encrypted and taken hostage, you don't have to worry about paying the ransom to give it back. That only solves one part of the problem, though, right? That's about getting access back to your data, so you getting back to being operational. It doesn't solve the breach in data that
someone else has the
data somewhere now, right? Because you didn't pay them. So if your governance and your kind of data sanitization is particularly great, then it's not going to help you solve that problem. But technically, it will help you not have to pay a ransom because you have your data available to you, which can be extremely valuable if you require that data operationally. Yeah, it doesn't help you reputationally. So that's one element. The other element is being able to make sure that only people can access, that there's no security holes in where your data is stored. So nobody can access your data. So if it's on-prem, again, we're talking about old static infrastructure. Typically it's castle and moat. Usually you'd have various different layers of security that someone would have to
these halcyon days of castle and moat. I mean, I wasn't in IT at the time, but it sounds so much easier to secure.
We're in the we're in the high trust zone. It's all good in the high trust zone. So cloud, there's no trust zone, right? So you have to be really vigilant about applying the right security policies to any data that's exposed publicly. And what this can mean is data that shouldn't be exposed publicly, make sure that it isn't, or that it can't be exposed publicly. Or if it is exposed publicly, you're aware of it immediately, you can revert the changes.
Yeah.
Or data that is provided exposed publicly, that's the right type of data exposed, that we don't have data that shouldn't be exposed publicly inadvertently end up in those areas. And again, the use case here is to leverage, again, a CASB solution in the first instance for both of these and for a couple of different use cases. So first and foremost is to have a data loss prevention policy. So we can identify data. And again, this is where we can use CASB, a CASB solution, or we can use something like Varonis. So Varonis is going to be able to identify the data for you, can categorize that data, and you can understand exactly where across your organization and across your whole estate where data is and how it's categorized. Which kind of also falls into the visibility kind of V, because you can't defend against things that you don't know where your stuff is, right?
Yeah.
So you need to understand where everything is and to what level it is currently being exposed and how sensitive it is. And when you have that, then you can start to apply the right security controls to pull it back into where it needs to be, and then wrap around those controls to make sure it's only accessed by those that need to access it. So that's one element. So we can have these data loss prevention policies that stop people accessing something if they shouldn't. We need to couple that typically with IAM, because we need to be able to identify who these people are to be able to apply those granular security controls. But we ultimately get to a position where if somebody can access something, they should be able to, and if they shouldn't be able to access anything, they can't. In the cloud. So we need to be able to do that in the cloud. Also, we need to be at the point where we're doing retrospective scanning of information to make sure that if for whatever reason data does inadvertently end up somewhere it shouldn't, that it's removed, and that we then review the policy and apply the security controls to understand how it got there and make sure it doesn't get there again, which is something that's going to happen in huge cloud environments. The other side of that coin is that actually it might be that an organization has these policies, they have these security policies, and they believe they've deployed them, but they have no real way of auditing and testing that they've done it that is easy for them to monitor.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where things like the public cloud compliance, audit and compliance elements of a CASB solution, of a cloud security solution like Netskope comes in, because Netskope can then carry out audits on your cloud estate. So it can inventory everything. So it can tell you how many EC2 instances there are, how many S3 buckets there are, how many blob storage elements there are, how many Azure instances there are, etc. It can tell you exactly where they are, within which accounts they reside, and it can tell you the types of security policy that are applied against those, and then provide you with an audit, essentially, to say, okay, well, all of these S3 buckets are compliant. We've got the right security controls. These ones, actually, they don't, because this one can be accessed by anyone. This one has a certain control policy applied to it that means anybody from this particular range of IP addresses can access it. And again, you can check the posture of your cloud, your public cloud infrastructure, to make sure that the policies that you have set have been applied, and that there aren't any kind of gaps where somebody's going to come in and go, oh, I found an S3 bucket full of interesting data. I'm going to encrypt this and then hold it to ransom. So misconfiguration of those IAM solutions is easily at the moment one of the major problems, because of the pace at which it's deployed, and often because it's dependent on the technologies that are used to deploy it.
So these are both prevention, and then the actual, if even though you've got a DLP policy and you're auditing regularly, you might still have an incident. Mm-hmm. And then it's the responding to the incident as well. You need all of that sort of setup as well. Are there any automated responses or?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So we would rely upon that information from an auditing perspective to understand when there have been breaches. Mm-hmm. And there are a couple of different solutions, which kind of harkens back to our original conversation about depending on how people do things, right? So if you're the type of organization that likes to do things natively with tools, then awesome, you can kind of do that. So if we take AWS, for example, you could build a Lambda in AWS that, if you've detected that your S3 bucket is open to the public and shouldn't be, then the Lambda will run and it can remove the public access from that bucket, which is really good if you've got AWS. The difficulty being is that if you're multi-cloud, then that doesn't necessarily work. So you might have to have multiple iterations of that kind of capability. And as well, if you want to do a little bit more than that, then integration becomes difficult, because so AWS is fantastic at orchestrating its own capabilities, but it doesn't necessarily have, there's some scope, but not total scope for it to be able to orchestrate with other tools entirely. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of where then another solution, such as Phantom, for example, which would be a security orchestration and automated response tool, can do that orchestration for you. So when we talk about SOAR, it really, for me, and it's in the name, but it's about doing two things. The first one is about orchestration. And what we really mean by orchestration is being able to do all of the cool stuff that our tools can do, but from one place.
Yeah.
So having that one level of integration. So rather than having to rely upon integrating tool A with tool B, and then integrating tool B with tool C, and then integrating all these tiny little integrations, we want one platform to do that orchestration for us. It is the conductor in our orchestra.
So much more maintainable. Otherwise, the nightmare I can see.
And you can do so much more with it, right? Because you can, depending on how you've configured it, you can orchestrate tools that don't natively integrate, because it's all done through the orchestration platform. And then once you've got that orchestration, the next step is then automation, because now that you can orchestrate things, then now everything can be automated. So if we go back to the scenario of an S3 bucket, what you can do is, if an S3 bucket has been made public, rather than just have it automatically closed, because that's your green or red light policy for public S3 buckets, you can receive that information and say, there's an S3 bucket been made public. You can understand who made it public, where was that configuration made from, was it a particular IP address within a range that we understand to be ours? Was it done through a console? Was it done through CLI? How was it done? You can pull all that information up. And then once you've got all of these kind of informational artifacts, you can then process them individually and say, okay, well, do we know that IP address? Has it got high risk associated with it? Has it got bad reputation? Who's this user? What else have they been doing? Where is it done from? Was there anything else that's associated with that particular account being carried out? And you can pull up all of this information and apply it to a playbook of steps that are worked through logically. And then depending on each of the independent outcomes, you can then have some sort of automated response to either close the S3 bucket and automatically notify the individual who made it public that they shouldn't be doing that, or leave it open. So this seems a bit alien, but you might want to leave it open because there are some S3, depending on your organization, there might be some S3 buckets that you want them to be public, but you might want to have some more granular security control applied against them. And others might want a bucket to be public because they want people to carry out malware against it because they're gathering intelligence, for example. So we don't want to leave those organizations out as well. So you might want to do it in a way that, it might not always be prudent.
There's some nuance.
Down.
Yeah.
You want to be able to have that granularity, and you can do that through a kind of, that granularity is given more easily through a SOAR product.
Well, we've covered so much content, Baz. Bless you.
Right.
What are the next steps for clients if any of this is ringing true, or if anyone's grappling with this sort of cloud security, how to secure my cloud question, or how to make things work together better interoperably? What are they going to do?
Yes, good question. So, so we're building out content like this. I'm sure others are as well. So it's always worth going out and trying to listen to various different conversations, various different talks, webinars, and just trying to get an understanding for what's about. Can be a bit of a risk because sometimes webinars might be skewed more salesy and they're not going to give you the information that you want. But there's lots of information out there. From our perspective, you can always come and have a conversation with us. And actually, it's something that we're building on now is developing a specific kind of cloud capability assessment. So rather than it being maybe like some of our other assessments, which are more based around technology, from a cloud capability assessment, what we're looking at is how are you leveraging the cloud as an organization? What tools and capabilities do you already have from a cloud capability perspective? And let's have a discussion about your vision. So where do you want to be? What is it that you want to protect from a cloud perspective, and try and understand what your threats are, what we call the crocodiles nearest the canoe from a security cloud perspective, right? Because there's going to be lots. I don't think there's any organization that can say they're 100% cloud secure. Far from it for the most part. But you can't do everything at once. So let's understand, where those crocodiles are, the nearest ones, so we can develop some sort of strategy to, whack them with a paddle.
It's actually helping prioritize and looking at what people have already. Absolutely. And working out what we should do next. Yeah, so basically just get in touch. I'll put in into the podcast information how to get in touch with us. Marketing at somerfordassociates.com is usually a good start. Can triage from there. But thank you, Baz, for describing through some of those practical examples of what you need to do and different capabilities that we have and that people have to deal with this securing your cloud question.
No problem. You're very welcome.